Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Pokemon Go, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, I'm going to be imparting some world's wisdom to you all today. Doing some lessons before London. We are 9 days away from day one of the World Championships 2022. It's been a long time since our last Worlds, and this may be a number of players' first time attending the World Championships or even attending the Open. And I wanted to give some thoughts about how I have approached previous World Championships, where my pitfalls have been, and things that I now really try and focus on when deciding on my deck and my final 60 going into the World Championships, because it is a fairly unique tournament, especially in that day one scenario, where you are usually looking for an X2 record, meaning that you can lose twice or tie 3 times, essentially, to be able to progress into the next day of the tournament. Some people say this is not too different from a regional in terms of looking for a 6-2-1 record, but you can make a few adjustments based on the record that you're aiming for here, where ties are a significant disadvantage compared to tying in regionals, where it's not just that next day of progression that you can achieve. You can also get other solid records that will grant you, top 64s, top 128s, that sort of thing, and you can slowly grind points throughout the entire season. This is just a one and done tournament, so you really have to try and spike the event if you want to firstly make it to that second day of competition, and then if you are in that second day of competition, again, need a very impressive record. If we're assuming 9 rounds, again, you need to go probably 7-2 or 7-1-1 to progress. So we're going to start with 2016. This was my first ever World Championships. It was in San Fran, and the newest set of the time was Steam Siege. These are kind of like the most impactful cards coming out of Steam Siege, as well as a promo, the Shaman EX. These were kind of the things that people had in mind in terms of metagaming. And I'm going to tie this in a bow later on, looking at 2022, of course. But this is really the things that we had to adapt from and look at the metagame in terms of how it was doing for the US Nationals and other national tournaments, what decks were thriving, and things that we had to anticipate going into Worlds. So I think, no doubt, Night March was one of the sort of top decks on the radar. It gained Pokemon Ranger to have a way around Seismitoad and Giratina. So that was a real big upgrade for Night March, which otherwise would have a pretty rough time against just a Quaking Punch spam. And as you can see, Seismitoad were some of the top decks in the format at the time. So having a new inbuilt answer with Ranger was one of the biggest cards actually coming out of Steam Siege, and how it adapted the format. At the same time, Ranger made Giratina worse in Darkrai decks, where the Chaos Wheel was just less powerful. And also Jolteon in Mega Manetric was potentially at threat as well, whereas the Jolteon was very good at denying all basic attacking decks. As long as you can continue to attack with that Jolteon, you could get through things like Toad Tina, Aquabox, Dark Tina, all this sort of stuff. You cover straight away, just with Jolteon being a really annoying wall, and Ranger now gave people a Versus Seeker option to get around it and get through the Jolteon, making it much less powerful. So these are some of the key things to think about when going into the new format, based on the previous results of the national championships and what new introductions there possibly were. Volcanion EX did seem to be like the flagship card coming out of the set, but didn't necessarily seem all that powerful in a format where Toad was already very strong, and the Toad Aquabox deck could easily play a plethora of water attacking mons that was a bit of a worry for a 2-prizer like Volk, and at the same time low hit points 2-prize Pokemon was pretty easy for Night March to deal with. So I think the key takeaways going into this format were there was a lot of item lock, there was Trevenant, there was Toad variants, and there was Vileplume, mostly Vespi-Vile, but also a couple other Vileplume lock decks with like Zygarde and Carbink and a few things here and there. These were some of the most popular decks in the room, and of course Night March was one of the key things to consider. Greninja had just done very badly at the US Nationals. This was obviously before ICs. It actually performed worse than Zygarde Carbink, which was kind of a rogue deck, which was really interesting. And this is one of my pitfalls, actually, going into 2016 Worlds. I had assumed Greninja was more around like the 10th or so best deck in the room, and actually underrepresented or underrated Talonflame going into this event. So that's a big reason why I didn't do all that well in 2016. As we look at my deck choice, I went for a deck that really hard targeted some of the best decks in the room. I went with a Yveltal sort of one prize box going on here, where I had a number of the Mews that would allow me to copy Quaking Punch or some of these attacks from the Yveltals with a discount. Because Night March and Trev were so popular, D-Valley was everywhere. It meant that I could get -1s on some of these higher attack costs very easily with Mew. And it allowed me to do some really cheeky plays. Having Psychic type coverage was also really good into Hooper EX, which was played in a lot of decks, like Dark Tina Garb, also Aquabox, Toad Tina, all these things played very often Hooper EX to get things rolling. So having a revenge attack on a Psychic Mon allowed me to have an easy 2-prize Gust attack, sometimes even for just 1 energy with D-Valley. So this was a rogue deck essentially that I had constructed to have a pretty favourable Night March, which I think with a number of 1-prize attacking mons that could use Oblivion Wing and even Pitch Black Spear very often, and staying as a 1-prize attacking deck really gave me a decent time into Night March. Also very strong into Trevenant with so many dark attacking threats. And pretty strong into Vileplume variants as well, which actually won the UK Nationals, which was why it was so high on my radar, because you had Fright Knight to shut down Floatstone on Vileplumes, and then you can trap them active. So whilst you Pitch Black Spear around like other threats on their board and knock them all out. So I was very happy actually with my metagame choice with this deck, and I thought it was a very strong rogue concept that I'd come up with. It's surprisingly very similar in the game plan of Mega Ordino, which ended up winning a Worlds. But of course, Mega Ordino had a better time into Greninja because it just had higher damage output in general. And this is where I was kind of too narrow visioned in the metagame, and it was actually a wider metagame than I'd anticipated. I was expecting Manectric to do a way worse because Jolteon got worse because Ranger was a card being printed, and I would assume not many people would play a Mega Manectric for that reason. And I assume that Greninja had flopped so badly at the US Nats in particular and other nationals, essentially as soon as Aquabox came up as an archetype, because it played Articuno that was able to just knock out like Froakies and Frogadiers for many prizes before the Greninja even gets going. Aquabox had a really good time into Greninja, and it really hindered how the deck was performing. I assumed that they were going to be less popular for Worlds, and possibly I was just unfortunate to have faced 2 Greninja and 2 Mega Man that day, and I do actually think I was very unlucky. This deck probably should have made day 2, in all honesty, and I think if I run back the simulation, I would have done a lot better. I think I'd make day 2 probably like 7 times out of 10 with this deck list. I just happened to run into some bad matchups. But that's not to say that I was not too narrow, because 3 out of those 10 times, 1 being the one that I actually went through in person, I did face Greninjas that were playing Talonflame, and there actually were articles leading up to the event with Talonflame Greninja, so it was a fairly known thing. At the time, articles were much more popular. Like 6 Prizes articles were gospel back then, and if you saw writers writing about tech includes or list changes, this was really important to keep an eye on. And although I was targeting some of the top decks, simply because I wrote off Greninja and thought it was very bad because Aquabox was doing so well, I figured it would be less popular. And that didn't turn out to be the case. So the things I like about this list, it actually genuinely is very good into the top decks in this format. And at the same time, it's aggressive and a fairly straightforward deck. Like, yes, I have a few attacking options here, but at its core, I'm trying to use as many 1 prizes as possible, weaving in this Mew to copy Seismitoad and Yveltal when I need to, and use just high-tempo aggressive cards. Like, Oblivion Wing was actually a super insane attack in this meta because it was very good into Trev, and it was very good into Night March. So even though it was just a 1 for 30 poke, it was like a very powerful concept in general. So yeah, I was very happy with this list. The only issue was that I had pretty much written off a couple of decks, which I ended up facing in the tournament and in general had adapted and survived. So it's one of those things where even if new cards come out in sets, people find a way to make their pet deck or what is inherently a strong deck, because there are a lot of strengths to Mega Manectric and there are a lot of strengths to Greninja, that they don't get wiped out straight away just by like a new card from a new set. They're still going to be played in some capacity, so you always have to respect that and expect these archetypes to not vanish off the face of the earth and still have game plans for them. So that's my first deck, where this is actually one of the decks that I think was the best deck I've played for Worlds, surprisingly. And it's a little bit upsetting I didn't do better with it, and I still believe this was a really, really strong deck for the tournament. But that said, whenever you're playing a rogue or an anti-meta deck, you know that you are playing that matchup roulette. Things can just go wrong for you in those first few rounds. Then suddenly you're on records of people who have taken losses. Maybe they've not made the best choice for Worlds either. And as soon as that happens, you're in the mire. You could be up against basically anything legal at the time. And that is exactly what happened to me at this Worlds, where I lost to 2 Greninjas and lost to one of my 2 Manetrics and beat the other one. But by that point, I was already out of the tournament because I'd have lost 3 times. So yeah, pretty sad Worlds. My first ever Worlds experience as well, but a lot to learn from that one. In at 2017, we had Burning Shadows release, and this was a massively, massively impactful set where we got Guzma, we got Acerola as well for healing of very high hit point Pokemon. Specifically, cards like Gardevoir GX could take advantage of this. 230 hit points at the time was monstrous, and Gardevoir was essentially just a really overstated card, where you had Secret Spring, you had Infinite Force, which was really high tempo and damage, and Twilight GX was the big thing here. The reason why Gardevoir became an instant hit was because before Burning Shadows, Garbodor decks were everywhere. Espeon Garb, Drampa Garb, these were some of the top decks of the game, and having a Twilight GX attack essentially made the Trash Launch Garbodor way less useful, because whenever your opponent chooses to use that Twilight GX attack, they can put a ton of item cards back into their deck and really ruin what is otherwise seen as your late game attacker in these Garbodor decks. So it forced more 2 prizes onto the field that Gardevoir could KO very nicely with Infinite Force, gave them a better prize map. So that's definitely a big contender from the World Championships. As soon as Gardevoir was printed, there was a huge expectation of this deck to be popular and be one of the strongest decks in the room. And most importantly, it instantly challenged what was previously seen as the strongest deck, which was Drampa Garb or Espeon Garb. So that's always something to bear in mind. There was also Gliscopod. I don't think a lot of people switched on to Golly Garb necessarily as quickly as possible, but there were also murmurings of Gliscopod Vileplume, Gliscopod Decidueye, Gliscopod Stage 1s with like Evolutions and Zoroark and stuff like that, but we knew Gliscopod was a really strong card, especially because it had great synergy with Acerola and Guzma. We were basically given these cards all in one go, and it's pretty obvious that Gliscopod just in a vacuum was a super efficient and strong card, so people were definitely building around that come Worlds. And Ho-EX, definitely a nice new inclusion into Volk. It actually made your Greninja matchup much more winnable, which was very awkward previously, and it also allowed you to have a Kiawe option into Garbodor decks. So in theory, Volk was getting stronger into Garb matchups, although it did have to contend with Gardevoir GX, which obviously takes advantage of other archetypes that like to put lots of energy into play, which Volk was certainly one of those. So certainly Gardevoir was the big newcomer in the room, and then there were some question marks about how Golly was going to be perceived and played. There were some question marks around Volk, one of the best performers in some of the events before this, some of the ICs. By this point, Deciplume had just done well at an IC as well, at the NAIC. There was also Rayquaza, although by this point there was the potential for Sudowoodo to try and block down the Rayquaza and Parallel City, so there was reasons to not like the Ray, but it did have really high damage potential and tempo. There was Ninetales that had somewhat of a spread approach available to it and was just a relatively consistent high-hitting deck. Greninja could be a bit of a foil to Gardevoir and was just a little bit inconsistent, but certainly powerful when it got going. Metagross pretty much just in the format to have a good time into Guardi, and with the new addition of Necrozma from this set, have a better time into Rayquaza as well by being able to Black Ray GX into a ton of Shaymins. And there was also Vikabulu, another sort of Stage 2 setup deck that also had a reasonable time into Guardi, I think, because often you removed all your energy from the Bulu, forcing the Guardi to like overcommit with their Infinite Forces to do any reasonable damage, and that was always a pretty good strategy for you as well. So yeah, the Vikabulu, a pretty nice beat-down deck as well. These were kind of the top decks in the meta, Guardi being the new kid on the block, really. So my deck choice was actually Espeon Garb for this one, and Espeon Garb was a really well-established top performer pre-Burning Shadows, and I think In this case, the list that I chose to play was actually 4 cards off Xander Perro's semi-finalist list. So the list I played was actually very strong, and I think that's something you can always consider when you know an archetype is heavily played, well-respected, it's had time to grow and adapt through the format, that you're going to be going into the tournament with a very strong deck. And you know that inherently your 60 cards will be close to optimal, because there's been so many iterations of this deck at that point. There's so many eyes on this archetype. Everyone's had their say. The Hive Mider's been in action, and you know that this is a very solid deck list with a lot of strengths to it. The weaknesses for Espeon Garb, specifically the list that I have in front of you, the 2017 list that I chose, I was disrespecting Wonder Energy and how much that adapted this matchup in particular, where it would deny the confusion that Psybeam was going for, which was a big part of Espeon GX's game plan into the Guardi. You just try and confusion span them as much as possible, force them to pay retreat, force them to find switching cards, all under Garbatoxin lock is kind of the idea here. Denying that Secret Spring whilst confusing at the same time is a real headache for them and can be really annoying. While you just put prep damage onto a number of their Stage 2 Pokemon, ideally with Garbatoxin and a spam of ends, your opponent is not able to set up multiple Stage 2s all in one go, and you can find a position to divide GX or use Psychic if the opponent does overcommit. And it has a very similar strategy to the Gliscopod, really, where you can stick a 1 energy attachment on an Espeon for a long time, just Psybeaming away and force the opponent to come up with the answers, really. But Wonder Energy, ever since the I think it was an Origins event, actually, where Espeon Garb ended up winning the tournament. And this is like 2 weeks before Worlds, and it was like a cash tournament, so the winner got X amount, and it got some publicity and notoriety that Espeon Garb had just been doing well. And because of that tournament result, the Guardi players were adapting. They were adding in Wonder Energies into their list, and it was improving the Espeon matchup. It was also improving spread devolve game plans that were also coming out in the format, where Espeon EX actually was picking up lots of candied Rolts and whatnot, and a Wonder Energy protects your board from, lots of Cocoa spreads and taking knockouts. So this was a card that was on the rise, and it's something that, again, I didn't necessarily respect. In the first instance, in 2016, I didn't respect Talonflame. In 2017, I didn't respect Wonder Energy and the mass movement towards Wonder Energy as being a core tech include. Now, again, I faced 3 Guardi in my first 4 rounds, and I faced very, very heavily teched builds. I faced a list with 3 Wonder and 3 Acerola in my first round, so I'm basically never winning that one. And I faced a Sylveon Guardi, which was less popular at the time than just having Alolan, Vulpix, and Diancie as setup mons. And the reason why the Sylveon is so difficult is because, of course, they can use the magical ribbon to get cards without having to play items. They could just get the physical Curlias and Guardies and set up in my face, and it was just very difficult to deal with. So again, pinch of bad luck, that is going to be a thing that happens to you at Worlds. You're going to have rounds where you don't want to be sitting down against your opponent. You'll have a bad matchup. They'll have techs for you no matter what deck you're playing. That's going to happen at Worlds, and knowing how to react to that is going to be a big reason why you will or won't do well, and how adaptive your list can be. So essentially, I was underprepared for Wonder Energy going into this tournament. Now, Espeon Garb still did really well in this event. It got top 4 and top 8, and there was another like Garbodor Coco spread deck that also made top 8. So it was clearly a strong deck. Clearly did have win conditions, and maybe I did just face over-teched builds, and that's something you can't really expect. But never underestimate the impact that one new archetype entering the meta can have. I think Burning Shadow is a prime example where Gardevoir was extremely, extremely hyped, extremely powerful card in a vacuum, that it was going to work, it was going to be popular. It doesn't matter that it's a new deck. People will have had enough time to play this archetype, and just take the example now where the NAIC has been, 5 weeks since Worlds, or until Worlds. There's a long stint where basically everyone has time to test all the new toys. Anything from Pokemon Go, no stone has been left unturned at that point. Any new archetype, people will had the chance to test with it, whether it's Radiant Zard stuff, whether it's Luna Rock, whether it's Mewtwo, V-Star, any of this new stuff, Radiant, Blastoise combinations here and there. All of this, if you're really serious about testing, people will have done it. You'll have already seen videos and content on some of these new decks as well. So that wedge of time just gives people the confidence to iron out 60s even of new decks. So don't think that it's going to be the exact same metagame as Astral format. There certainly will be new introductions from Pokemon Go that are changing lists or bringing new decks to light out of nowhere. And don't just sort of sit on your laurels on a previous deck. If you can help it, try and give yourself an extra edge. I feel like if I was playing Parallel City in this list, which Xander actually chose to play one of his 4 differences, and if I played Acerola, which wasn't super popular, but is actually a pretty strong card into that Guardy to allow you to have that sort of poke around game plan, or if I had some energy disruption perhaps for Wonder Energies, I feel like I would have done much better in this tournament. So those 2 or 3 cards that would have let me respect Wonder Energy better would have really been the difference, I think, of beating a lot of these Guardies, because in general, Hammer plus N or whatever is a strong combo regardless, especially with Garbotoxin, and I just went too safe with the list, essentially. A lot of the cards that are different between mine and Xander's, actually, I play, like, 2 extra supporter cards, and I play, like, an extra Lele. So I just played, like, 3 extra consistency spaces. If I'd converted those into, like, E-Hammer, Parallel, and just like VS Seeker or whatever, just taking 2 of those spaces and turning them into, like, taking out consistency spaces and just still having that VS Seeker, just having that little bit more power on my side could have allowed me to go a lot further in the event. So trying to have that balance is a really important thing, and be very aware of acute changes in lists and how much it can affect a matchup. Think about, if you want to take a more recent example, look at the progression of Regigigas. I know this is a really strange thing to consider, but Regis, when it first came onto the scene, they were all playing Stormy Mountains. It was great. It was for a consistency reason. Then, obviously, Arcdura ended up winning a regional, and straight away Regis had to except that they had to remove consistency and add in Path of the Peak, because otherwise you're just sacrificing a matchup. So knowing when to make those acute changes to lists to keep them relevant is going to be a big thing for you at Worlds. In at 2018 then, Celestial Storm wasn't the most impactful set, really. Rayquaza was definitely the new big bad on the scene, but it was a 2-prize threat, and of course we had some really high power level decks at the time. Zoroark was extremely dominant in this period in a ton of different forms. We had Zoropod, Zoroark, Zorogarb, Zoro Control, things with Weavile, things with Zoroguardi as well. So Zoroark could pop up in all sorts of different ways and was just so consistent at its core that it was always going to see success. Magcargo as well was an extra card that could go into Zoroark to allow you to create even more combos and make it even more possible. Thanks to Ditto Prism Star, you could even have a 0-1 line of Magcargo, knowing that whenever it does come into play, Smooth Over was going to be a great deal for you. There was also Banette GX that I think a few people hyped going into the tournament because it did allow you to hit for weakness onto Buzzwole, had a natural resist as well, and was an efficient 1 energy attacking threat. So trying to combat Buzzrock, which was kind of the main deck competing with Zoro at the time. These decks were extremely successful and much more successful than the other decks in the format, and basically every time a new Sun and Moon set came out, these 2 decks remained powerful and just sort of stole bits and bobs from the latest set, but still remained the strongest decks in the room. Rayquaza was a powerful deck, of course, and did have high tempo at its disposal, very good internal consistency with Tempest as well, and it turned out to be one of the most disruptive decks in the game because it had access to Treasure and Let Loose, and I think this was the era when Let Loose started becoming more and more popular. It all started at this Worlds, so we have this... we have Pedro to blame and Eric from Rare Candy. We have those guys who are Marshadow gamers to blame for Let Loose plaguing the metagame since this. But yeah, Ray was a high-tempo, disruptive archetype, and also Shrine of Punishment, possibly the biggest card to come out from the set, allowed a Buzzgarb Shrine archetype to sprout out of the format. I think going into this Worlds, people were expecting Shrine to be very strong. We knew it was a powerful card. It's just the best combination of Shrine wasn't necessarily known. I think there were murmurs of Buzzgarb maybe a week or so before the event, and then it obviously showed up at the tournament, but it was mostly under wraps, and I think it certainly was day 2 play much more often than the day 1. A number of players did choose to play the deck in day 1. The sort of secret was revealed. A lot of people made it to day 2 with the archetype. And then people immediately bandwagoned and started teching for the list. I remember Pedro's top 4 list plays a Xurkitree GX just because Buzzgarb Shrine was just playing Rainbows and other special energies. So you could completely wall out that deck just by having a Xurkitree in your list. So, and making sure that you bounce Shrine of Punishment enough times. So people will make these knee jerks, and if you are someone that is fortunate enough to make it through day one with especially newer decks or decks that people may not necessarily be prepared for, be aware that people are always watching whoever progresses through day one and might adapt their list accordingly, especially something like Buzzgarb, which really hit the ground running day one, and a lot of people did progress through the tournament. At the same time, there was Greninja, pretty good into most Zoroark builds apart from the pod, and winnable against Buzzrock. And Mali, very weak into Zoro, so I think it was a pretty weak deck, actually, for the event. And obviously there was Garbodor around as well, but did at least punish Buzzrock to an extent, and was pretty okay into Rayquaza as well. So there were some reasons for this deck to still see play, and at the end of the day was one of the stronger decks in the room. So here's my deck of choice. I decided to go with the Buzz side of things rather than the Zoro side of things. I was just too worried about Zoro control, really. It was picking up a lot of pace in 2018, and it made me shy away from Zoro Pod, which was my favourite way to play Zoroark at the time. And if I was to play Zoro control myself, I would have had to have Mirror Tex and really warp the deck in a way that I wasn't too happy with. So I knew pretty early that I was going to be on Buzz, because I thought it was a natural counter, or at least gave you a lot of tempo and advantage into Zoro. The one thing that I didn't do was play the Lycanroc part of the deck, which a lot of people will say is crazy because it's a very strong card internally, gave you extra gusting, it allowed you to gust on turns where you dug with Sycamore, or it allowed you to N and gust up an Octillery and knock it out for mirror match situations, and obviously Lycanroc's a really, really strong card, and ultimately, I think looking back, I probably should have played at least a 1-1 Lycanroc. I don't think I would have gone whole hog and played like a split of Beast Ring and Elixir, and like the full 2-2 Lycanroc, as well as all the stuff I played, because I did, like, at the time, Buzzrock was an extremely powerful deck, but a very bricky deck at the same time. Like, sometimes it just completely fell on its face, didn't do anything. So the spaces I gained by removing the Lycanroc were cards that I really enjoyed having. I loved having extra supporter cards. I loved having the Field Blower, big card to enable you to continue to draw under Garbodor, of course, and it was very strong into the Rayquaza matchup by allowing you to get rid of Batons or Fury Belts. Just a very strong card in general. So the cards that I gained by removing the Lycanroc were helpful and were strong, certainly. But at the end of the day, when you look at this list, it lacks power level. It's just not as strong as Buzzrock, even with the inconsistencies that the Lycanroc package added to the deck. So, and the other thing to bear in mind is, now that I don't have Elixir, I'm all in on Beast Ring. And Beast Ring isn't the most easy combination to get with, because you could have drawn too many fighting energy at the time, or you have to consistently super rod energies back into your deck, so that when you are playing those researches, when you are playing those Cynthias, you could draw into the energies and not the Beast Rings. You could just not draw into the Beast Rings at all, or you could draw into Beast Rings without having the right Pokemon into play. There's a lot of awkward sequencing that can happen with the Beast Ring, and even with 2 Tortillery and 4 Beast Ring and a high counter basic energy, things could go wrong. And I think too many of my rounds, things went wrong. I actually lost to a Zoro Control, which with this list should basically never happen. I was actually in a really unfortunate situation where I prized double Remoraid 2 times in a row, and I got end out of the game, essentially, which was very, very sad. But this was actually the best I've done in day one of Worlds. I was for the winning in, and I lost against a Rayquaza in, again, fairly unfortunate circumstances where they happened to lead a Marshadow, and it meant that I couldn't tempo out early with Jet Punches. And with this list, when you don't have a Lycanroc GX attack to fall back on, you really needed early Jet Punch pressure so you could lead into that Sledgehammer turn and take a KO with Sledgehammer. If you weren't taking KO with Sledgehammer, you were in a pretty bad spot. And you have a ton of damage mods, of course, but it normally relied on Jet Punch putting prep 30s around the board to get you into that state. So I was pretty unfortunate to not beat a Rayquaza, and I was extremely unfortunate to not beat a Zoro Control when the matchup was extremely favoured. I absolutely decimated them in the first 10 minutes in game 1, and then games 2 and 3 things go awry, and I'm basically crying when I'm not able to get my artilleries developed in either game, but it is what it is. And I remember being able to win for 3 turns, just having a turn attachment would have won me the game for 3 turns against this guy, and I wasn't able to. So I actually think this deck was strong. And again, I've stuck to an aggressive deck with a very straightforward game plan. This is even more straightforward than Buzz Rock, really, because you're all in on buzzing, and essentially the only thing you need to be aware of is how many 2 prizes you're putting down, and when and where your opponent can try and play around the beast ring turns, and where to manually attach. Essentially, because you didn't have any burst excel from Elixir, you had to be extremely careful with every single manual attachment and never attach wrong. Those were really the only things that were intricate about this deck compared to a Buzz Rock. But in other regards, it was just like a way more consistent build that had a lot of high tempo to it, with Beast Energy, 4 Strong, and 4 Choice Band in particular. You had insane tempo at your disposal. And you had protection against them as long as you could develop your artillery with 2 Super Rod, 3 Brooklet, and a 2/2 artillery. That was pretty easy to do in most situations, but yeah. And I also think another thing that identified well, as we saw in the last slide, the metagame was narrow. Like, Zoroark decks, very good. Buzzrock, very good. Then there was Rayquaza, which turned out to be very good. People were sort of ho-humming about how well it was going to perform, and it turned out that a heavy Marshadow was the way to play the deck to just stop people playing altogether. And then Buzzgarb Shrine was another sort of like unknown quantity at the time. So going into the event, it was like, so are you playing Zoro or are you playing Buzz? Like, that was really it. And targeting one half of those decks by playing the Zoro part, playing the Buzz to target Zoro made a lot of sense. And I think when you are in a narrow metagame, targeting works, but you have to be very careful about when you target, because there can be metagames that seem narrow. Like right now, many people will just tell you, oh, beat Palkia, beat Arceus, you're going to have a good time. But in reality, there are probably like 12 decks that you could play in Worlds right now. And actually, there's probably 10 different types of Arceus you could play, not just Arc Intel. So it's more complicated than that. And I think if we're looking at 2022, it's probably not a great idea to just target the top decks in the room, which would probably be Palkia and Arc Intel. As easy as it is to say that that's going to be a good percentage of the room, I think also they're going to be targeted. People are going to be testing all sorts of different stuff, and the format seems too wide. There's basically too many sets legal right now because we didn't have a rotation, that everything is very consistent, and even random like techie decks work enough of the time that they're going to be threats in the game. Excuse me. On to 2019 then. This was in DC. And this was a really interesting Worlds because not only did we have Unified Minds, which had a ton of extremely, extremely good cards on the drop, really, we also had a rotation. And a rotation meant that we, once again, didn't have many decks that were truly viable because there just weren't enough consistency cards in the game. For search of non-GX cards, we only had Pokemon Communication. So it essentially meant that we had to play GX decks. And the only other exception to that rule would be Naganadel, because you had Ultra Space, or Mali, because you had Treasure. Basically everything else you had to play GXs, just because you got to play 4 Cherish Ball and a Dene, and it meant your deck worked way more than any other deck in the room. Pikarom was definitely one of the front runners for this Worlds. It had the option to play Volkners, which gave you great access to Stamp in the late game, giving you defensive plays, and you got Raichu from the set, which gave you a Lightning Ride GX attack that allowed you to one-hit KO opposing tag teams, and this was probably one of the only things that Pikarom was lacking at the time. Having that extra push potential without needing, like a combination of 3 or 4 Electro Power was huge for you. Reshizard was also very popular going into Worlds. Greenzard was probably the most known variant at the time. It wasn't until Worlds where we saw the Ninetales Victini Prism combination happen. So the expectation was that it was going to be greens-based Reshizards that had lots of healing cards, like Mixed Herbs even, going into their list, and some of them playing things like Shrine or Dojo to be able to reach one-hit KOs onto Pikarom, which was one of the most known decks in the room. Mali was pretty much the only one-prize deck that I would have considered for Worlds, simply because it had the access to Treasure, and it had Giratina, which was infinitely able to cycle itself, so you only need to get one of them set up, and then it can keep returning back to you whenever you needed it to. And this was a relatively good card into 3 prizes, of course, because you could 2-hit KO them, and in theory you're up trading as long as the Reshizard's not healing, or if there's no super scoop ups, which were actually played at this Worlds just to try and beat Mali, surprisingly enough. And at the same time you had some bench control with the Distortion Door and with spell tags as well, so you could set up some Pokemon, take advantage of like Jirachi's being played potentially in Pikarom, or other just low hit point things, which is pretty impressive. Also from this set, we gained SBDO and Tina Chomp, two pretty powerful tag team GX Pokemon. Interestingly enough, SBDO ended up being a stronger card in the Mewtwo deck, but this was also played heavily in Mali as well, just to have that cross division option for you, because oftentimes in Mirror, Mali was not playing any Gust. It was just using Distortion Door and Spell Tag and like spread attackers to target bench Pokemon. It actually meant that you're allowed to bench this card in Mirror and then try and get to a 6 energy cross divide and have a huge amount of counters coming onto the field all in one go. And the Tina Chomp was also pretty interesting, having that Calamita Slash and GGN, two big like walloping attacks that the Mali didn't always have access to. Like, you had Ultra Necrozma, but it wasn't all that powerful. It was actually mostly used for spread in Mirror. Having the Tina Chomp gave you access to one-hit KO, Reshizard in particular, which I think was a big deal because otherwise Reshizard could just try and Mixed Herb heal you all the time, and that was a bit of an issue for you. So having some one-hit KO potential was pretty appealing. It also gave the option to play Fighting Energy, which meant that you could play some random tech cards in the Mali if you really wanted to. Like, we even saw Marsh Champ even being a tech card to try and help it out against Pikarom here and there. So Mali was pretty promising and one of the more hyped decks for sure. I think these three decks were certainly the most hyped going into Worlds. It was one of the narrowest metas I'd really seen. Mewtwo was kind of unsolved, and just on paper it didn't have a good time into Mali, so people were already skeptical of the deck. But looking back, of course, it had a lot of cards at its disposal, and it was some very intelligent players that were able to crack good 60s, where they saw the potential of Hearth and Naga coming into their list, and just seeing the amount of acceleration that it had available with Welder and Solgaleo at its disposal. It could get all sorts of attacks out of nowhere, and obviously it helped that Malamar did very poorly day one, and it really opened the floodgates for Mewtwo to do well in day two, because most people would have been put off the day one performance of Malamar. And I think, again, that's a big help to players choosing decks based on the day one performance, because it means the metagame basically changes within a day at Worlds. So seeing Malamar flop basically gave Mewtwo more of a license to perform well at Worlds in 2019. And to be fair, it was with great innovation. You know, Mewtwo outperformed everyone's expectations because the list that was constructed by these handful of players was just so much better than the list that we'd previously seen. Coming out of Japan, there was like fair energy lists with the likes of Mina and using, Noivern GX for item lock. And even when we were playing Welder builds of Mewtwo at the time, they were also playing things like coach trainer and build analysis and all this other stuff that were just kind of taken out of the welder list, and you just said quad welder, as many Hearth as possible, lots of Denes, lots of outs to this sort of stuff, dig, and just smack as quickly as possible. That was just a way better approach and a completely different list to most people's expectations. So be aware that with new cards coming out in sets, it can completely change up engines, and Mewtwo really benefited from that. Blounce was interesting because it gained Hearth, Naga, and potentially even Heatran as a way to get around Guardian. And the only issue for Blounce, of course, was that there was a Tapu Fini that came out in the set that basically allowed you to instantly uptrade for one colourless energy into Blounce. So anyone who wanted to tech for that matchup could do so. And it was a risky play for sure, although it did have good uptrade potential into these three prizes. It had to compete with other people teching against you with just one card include, and that could completely sway a matchup. So that was a bit of a headache against the Blounce. The Dark Box as well had a ton of inherent strengths. Like, seeing Weavile come out from the set was really exciting for a number of people because it was a throwback to Aromatisse, essentially. And having Umbreon, Darkrai, and even the Sabletar, two very powerful attacking Pokemon, just a little bit inconsistent, but the strength was there behind these cards. And even now, looking at Dark Moon GX and that text on the card, very dangerous threat in the game. So there was some expectation of Dark Box doing well. It actually did end up making top 16, even though this deck sort of faded into obscurity and was pretty much pictured as a meme. It did make top 16 at this World, so it was actually pretty powerful. And surprisingly enough, Shedinja was the deck that people were afraid of in terms of control at the time, because it had done well at the EUIC. And this was certainly one on people's radars. It turned out that people adapted towards playing Pidgeotto control by this point because Reset Stamp was actually very bad for Shedinja, because Shedinja loved using Sprint and having less than 6 cards available to it and never took prize cards, of course. So this deck ended up adapting, but going into Worlds, people were still aware of Shedinja, and it meant that cards like Lysander Labs were coming into deck lists to try and have a good time into the Shedinja approach. I definitely remember playing Pikarom lists with Lysander Labs at the time to turn off tools, so definitely something to bear in mind. It's funny how new cards in the metagame, you'd think that Stamp would be a really good card for this control deck, but it basically made it unplayable, and a new control deck was born out of this set that not many people expected. Again, of course, it was a team list, the Pidgeotto control, that ended up being an archetype at Worlds. It just so happened that Mewtwo had a good time into that with SB on Deoxys and being able to spread a couple of counters. A little bit fortunate here and there, but that just is testament to how flexible Mewtwo was for this event. So my deck choice was actually Malamar in the end. And this was probably my weakest choice ever. And you think I'd get closer and closer as Worlds go by, but I really panicked in 2019. I made a late switch to Mali, and I can't stress enough, never late switch. Like, it is such a bad idea. I'd be testing a ton of Pikarom, and I essentially tested Pikarom to the point where I played so many mirrors and wasn't seeing a way to have an advantage in the mirror that it really stressed me out and made me think that, oh, I'll face too much Pikarom mirror and I'll have a bad time. That might give you flashbacks or make you think even today about, how do I have an edge in Palkia Intel? How do I have an edge in Arc Intel? Maybe you might not find a way to have a good edge without completely ripping up your deck and making it sort of suboptimal just to have mirror match situations. And this panicked me. I was really panicked about playing Pikarom, thinking I wouldn't have a good enough time into my mirror match. How do I make that stronger? And in the end, I ended up making the jump to this deck. And the problem with making the jump, of course, is that I'm a lot less experienced with Malamar. So I'm already playing a slower deck that then I physically play slower because I'm less experienced with it. And even just looking at this 60 on paper, it's a suboptimal list. I played a third Giratina instead of a third Switch, and I remember this very specifically because I lost games in day one because I didn't have a third Switch in my deck. I remember losing to an Absol in the late game when I Jirachi whiffed my last Switch in deck. And I remember another occasion where I just had a Giratina stuck active for too many turns while I was using Cynthia and Lily and not able to find physical copy of Switch. So I think immediately just that one change could have won me a couple matchups, going down to 2 Giratina and having the third Switch. But I wasn't to know that because I hadn't played enough games at the time to know that it was so clearly obvious that third Switch was better. Now everyone knows that higher Switch count is really integral for the Mali, but at the time I didn't. I remember also debating things like Erica's Hospitality versus Judge as a way to disrupt Greenzard. But the whole point here is I didn't know. I didn't know the best way to play this deck at the time because it wasn't the deck that I'd focused on for Worlds. Do not make the late switch. It's one of the worst things you can do. Even if you are losing this week and the build up to Worlds with your deck, if it's something you've put a lot of time into and you're happy with your 60, or even if you're not happy with your 60, think about making a few 1 or 2 card changes to a list. I think that's a way better approach than ripping it up, starting from the ground, and just jumping on the bandwagon of what one of your friends are playing, or something that's just won against you, and you think, oh man, this is crazy, it's got a really good matchup into me, how do I win this? Why don't I play it myself? No, that's a really, really bad take. You should not have that knee-jerk. Trust your testing, trust your own list, and trust that if it's a known archetype in the game, it's there for a reason, it's a strong 60, and you can get the job done with that. This is the biggest regret I have is this Worlds. So far I've talked about getting unlucky here and there, and there's a round or two that didn't go my way in these sorts of instances, and that's going to happen. There's RNG in Pokemon. This Worlds, I don't deserve to be anywhere near day 2 because I was suboptimally playing a suboptimal 60 because I made a late switch, and that is just embarrassing, really. That's really, really bad. I was also playing a deck that was draw prone, which means it was slow. It was in a lot of situations, I had to play as a 1-prize deck until the very last turn of the game, and then I would put down a tag team Pokemon. So physically, I was making my opponents play for 5, 6 turns, 7 turns even, and that just made games long. Even if I was winning those games, I could easily lose a game 2 by just being an inconsistent deck. and then I'm suddenly in a draw position, which is essentially a loss position in a lot of cases. So, especially for a slow deck. So, that's pretty awkward. I overcomplicated this deck as well, and I think if you are playing a deck that doesn't naturally have the highest amount of consistency, think about what's a good example. We'll get to the 2022 stuff in a moment, but overcomplicating something that already is a little bit shaky on consistency is very awkward. I added in the Tina Chomp to have a better time into a heavy healing Reshizard, Greenzard, and I also added in custom catchers instead of acrobikes, which were very popular at the time. Acro was much more popular as an option, and Mali would just have no gust whatsoever. I went for customs to allow me to hit SBDO in mirror and to allow me to use my Tina Chomp more aggressively, but all of these things are like best case scenarios for the deck. Why didn't I not just think, why don't I get more setup in the game just by having acrobikes? And I remember custom capturing an embarrassing amount of times just to draw one or draw two because I was doing nothing with my hands. So the custom catcher was at least good in that aspect, but certainly not why I'd initially put it in the list for. And again, it goes back to me not being prepared enough with this 60. And one final thing, I made that switch because I was worried about not having an edge in mirror, but then I played another deck that didn't have an edge in mirror. I was playing a Mali list that wasn't favoured into other Mali because I was playing customs rather than acros, which just aren't as consistent, and I knew that Mali was a popular deck in the field. Other people knew that, so there were better tech cards, there were Ultra Necrozma builds that were just stronger in the Mali mirror against me, and it's something that I just wasn't doing. So my logic was so flawed in this instance. I chose to jump off a deck because it didn't have an edge in mirror to play another deck that I knew less, with a less good list, that also didn't have an edge in mirror. I still look back at this and think, what was going on in my head? I cannot believe I played Malabar. And it had to be Malabar as well, of all things, of course. So yeah, the only tiny bit of strength I can, or like the only perk I can give this is that I tried to speed up an archetype that was slower. I added in high damage output. I added in a Tina Chomp that can just sweep up a tag team Pokemon for a KO very easily, set them up with spell tags, set them up with Distortion Door, and you can put a Tina Chomp into play, take a KO, tank a hit, take a KO, the game can be done. So the one tiny slither of hope I give this list is that I made it more aggressive than the Tina tags, where you guarantee to have 7 or 8 turn games with your army of 1 prizes and try and grind out games. You still have that aspect to this list, but I had an aspect of the list that allowed me to turn on a dime and become an aggressive 60 to allow me to win quicker. And that's the only bit of solace I can take from this 2019 choice, because overall it was an absolute dud. So that brings me on to London 2022. So the set that we gain is Pokemon Go, and I think this is a probably less impactful set, certainly, than Unified Minds, probably less so than some of the others as well. I think it's around that sort of Steam Siege level where there's a couple things going on here and there. Radiant Zard's certainly a very strong card, which people have been trying to build around. Pokestop has been in and out of some deck lists, especially like turbo engines, or ones that like to have discard, like Blissey or Reggie's. And these are, there could be easily a few tweaks here or there to decks for certain, but I think on the whole, we're not going to see a huge amount of brand new archetypes unless it's something that's completely off everyone's radar, has managed to be kept under wraps even with the amount of information sharing we have in the game these days and the amount of online tournaments. I think pretty much everything has been known at this point, outside of maybe Sanders' latest creation. So I feel like we have a pretty good grasp of things, and there will be adaptations from the Pokemon Go expansion, but I still think that the decks on screen are the ones that I expect to be the most popular and the most powerful. I do think Palkia, Intel, and Arc Intel will be popular. I think there'll be a number of Arc Barrel builds as well, with different type coverages at its disposal. I can foresee Arc Duraludon, I can foresee Arc with even Mewtwo V Union potentially has been a deck that's been banded around. I could see Arc Toolboxes where you have a number of type coverages, the sort of Ian Robb style deck as well. I can certainly foresee them being some of the most popular stuff, but that's not to say that there won't be 5 to 10% of some of these other decks here or there. Like 10% for any of these sounds a little bit high, but just having a 5% share in any of these decks in the room means they're ones that you should consider, have a game plan into, and be comfortable against, where we have Mew, we have Mewtwo V Union, we have Bliss Tank, we have Dialga, we have Inteleon toolboxes. I have Radiant Zard here, but there could be all sorts of one prize Intel builds. We've got Reggie's, which obviously did win a 1,700 player in tournament in Japan. Of course, it won their nationals, so it could be a deck that we disrespect, but could be coming over from across the seas and have some representation. There's Ice Rider, which a lot of people are hyping up thanks to its damage output, and also Urshifu, one of those decks that has surprised the internets before and does have the power level to hang with the strongest decks in the metagame as well if crafted correctly. So these are some of the things that I would expect the most. There may be something that's relevant in the metagame that hasn't made it onto this slide, but these are probably the top decks I would expect, at least in terms of popularity. And I also think that this is unlike the Unified Minds meta, where there was only like 5 decks that could realistically function. We're actually in a format where everything functions really, really well because we have so much consistency with Inteleon, with turbo engines with Mew and Greninja, where we have Bibarel. Everything is, well, we have Genesect. Everything works extremely well right now. We can cycle to the bottom of our deck very quickly. Just look at Mewtwo v Union, where we have Heavy Ball Search, Trekking Shoes, Galarian Meowth, and Gourmandize. You can get to the bottom of your deck quick. So the game is actually extremely consistent right now, and there's a lot of different decks that can benefit from that. So I would say it's a pretty wide metagame that I'm expecting, although there is an emphasis on those top 2 decks. There's a reason why I've put them above the rest physically on the screen, because these are still the top dogs that you will have to consider. So my closing thoughts, I am aware that this has gone on a lot longer than I actually thought it was going to. But my first piece of advice, if you're going to take anything away from this, is that the main flop I did with Mali was because it wasn't my comfort pick. It wasn't the deck that I tested most with. I made a knee-jerk decision, and it really, really punished me. Try not to get lured in by something you saw do well in an online event just last week, and you just want to put some time into it. Sure, you can do that, and maybe it's okay, but ultimately I would stick with the decks you know the best. Maybe it's something you've played in a regional before, or played at NAIC, and you've made adaptations to that, and it's something that you know inside and out, because you playing well is going to do better than any metagame call you could possibly make, in my opinion. So definitely stick with your comfort pick. There's going to be ups and downs to any deck you choose in the format right now. There's no deck that simply beats everything. It just doesn't exist. So be comfortable, be well tested with whatever deck you choose. That's easily the best advice I could give. If you're well experienced with a couple of decks, here's a thing or two that I would also consider. Focus on something aggressive. I think if you can, if that fits within your model of a deck that you know well, an aggressive deck is something that I would lean towards as my difference maker if I was thinking about 2 different decks and one was more aggressive than the other. I would lean that way because the clock is a huge factor, and even if people tell you, oh, I'm playing a slow deck, but I'll just win best of 1, that's not the case. It's a lie, because the opponent can scoop at any time, and if they happen to scoop in the first 10 minutes, now you're stuck into a best of 3, and if you lose that game too, you're never winning a best of 3 series. So don't fall into the trap of playing a very slow deck, because your opponent is just in control of the clock as you are, and you can't help it if they scoop it up early. That's just on you. So if you can help it, try and play a deck fast. Be experienced with the deck. That will help you play as quickly as possible without making mistakes, and just be more comfortable with more situations. And even if you're playing a deck that's traditionally slower, do something similar to what I did with the Mali, where I tried to add some speedy cards. For example, if you were playing Arc Intel, maybe Zig Belt allows you to win games quicker when you have good hands or your opponent has bad hands, so then you get into that next game quicker to allow you to have that best of 3 scenario. I would also say don't get too focused on beating just 1 or 2 decks in the meta. It seems too wide. I put way too many cards or archetypes on that previous slide. It's not a similar case to Unified Minds meta. It's too many options right now for viable decks in the game, and there's too much consistency in all sorts of ways that it's reasonable that too many decks can perform well at this high level. So I wouldn't be just focused on saying, oh, I'll just beat Palkia, I'll just beat Arceus. I don't even know that if there are any decks that beat those 2 decks specifically, but just beating those 2 decks is still probably only going to be like 4 rounds of your day 1. And although that's a lot, there's a lot of rounds where if your deck isn't inherently strong or consistent, they can crumble against these other decks in the room as well. I would also consider every single slot in your list with an emphasis on consistency. Again, look back to that Mali list. I made like 2 or 3 changes. If I made 2 or 3 changes to that list, if I'd made 2 or 3 changes to the Espeon Garb, I think I would have been in a way better position. Even the 2016 list, even though I really liked the 60, if I'd respected some archetypes more and been less narrow-minded, I could give myself percentage points in a broader field by making a few adaptations. And that's something that you really have to think about. I think right now there are so many decks in the game that I would purely focus on consistency over anything else, and essentially only keep high value tech cards, even cards that you wouldn't really see as techs because they can be used in all sorts of situations. So something like a Leon in a Palkia, it's very good in Mirror. It can find ways to get one-hit KOs into Arc and into Mew. I see that as a high value tech card because there's a lot of matchups where you can see that Leon being extremely valuable compared to, let's just go with a Tool Jammer as an example, where it can be helpful in a number of spots, but it's really helping things like Ice Rider, it's helping things like Regis, it's helping things like Radiant Zard. These are things that I would expect to be way less strong than just playing the Leon in general. Now, of course, you can still play Tool Jammer. I think it's actually a pretty strong card anyway, because I've been minimalistic and it's still obviously very good against Mew and Arc anyway, so pretty bad example. But let's change this to be like a Starmie, where a Starmie could be strong into like Bliss Tank, and it could be strong into like Arc Dura, but it's not actually that strong in general matchups. Like, it's not strong in Mirror, it's not strong against Mew, there's all this sort of stuff. And if you're only play, like, I would much rather that card be just an extra energy. Like, if that's an extra capture, I'm just way happier with my outcomes because I just get a Palkia and play turn 1 that much more. So I would definitely value every single slot in the list and look towards consistency and let that be your deciding factor, because every other deck in the game is so consistent right now, you need to be able to keep up, and if you over-tech, you're going to have problems. The final piece of advice I would say is to scout other top lists right now. Have a picture in your mind of what an expected 60 will be for Palkia Inteleon, what it's going to look like if it's going to be Arc Intel, if it's going to be barrel lists, what are they going to be playing, what are they not playing. If you see a card that stands out as something you necessarily don't expect, what are the first cards on the chopping block for these expected 60s, because these are really things that you're going to have to keep in mind with, because of course with closed deck lists, very different to all these online open deck list events that you may have been playing in, you have to be aware of certain tech includes that they may have or may have cut from their list, and having a good picture of what an expected 60 is going to really help you get to that that picture in your mind and see how you can navigate these matchups. And if there is a specific matchup that you need to test, it's way better to find a friend to playtest that matchup with you rather than just hit the ladder and spend hours and hours and hours playing against random janky decks where you don't know how good the player is, you don't know how good their list is, and you're really not maximizing the usefulness of your time. It's crunch time. Anyone who's going to Worlds is going to want to play the game right now. Call up your friends, try and find a time to test with them, iron out some matchups that you may not be confident in, do vice versa for them. Everyone's happy, everyone's going to use their time more effectively than just grinding ladder. Definitely use your friends, use your contacts, and make sure that you're as prepared as possible. Don't leave a stone unturned for the matchup that you're unsure of. Try and at least talk through those matchups and see, at least in theory, how you're going to do against the expected metagame. So that's a lot of information. I ended up talking for way longer than I expected, so I apologize for that, but it's something I'm very passionate about. I've failed at Worlds too many times now to let you guys make the same mistake. I really want to see everyone doing well, and yeah, I cannot wait for Worlds. I'm, of course, commentating, so I'm going to be there throughout the entire week, and I'm going to try and be wandering through the tables as well, so say hello if you get the chance. I'm really excited for everyone to be enjoying their time in London, so I'll see you there. Thanks so much for watching. See you for another video tomorrow. Cheers.